You know, I love podcasting. I have since 2006, back when you had to use like a Dixie cup with string to make the thing work. And that's why I'm so excited that we recently moved Mysterious Goings On to Anchor FM to record our podcast. I gotta tell you, I don't regret it a bit. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. First of all, it's free. There's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast for you so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. And you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. It's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. Not going to lie to you, when I first heard about Anchor, I was a little dubious because I've been doing it the hard way for so long. But I got to tell you, it's very easy. Use a Stripe account. Get sponsors. You're not paying monthly hosting fees. The sound quality is great. The distribution is phenomenal. Friends, download the free Anchor app today if you want to start your own podcast, or go to anchor.fm to get started. Remember, you heard it here first on Mysterious Goings On.
May God's blessing be upon you as we gather today to praise God for the life of Reverend Jeff Hamilton. Today we will share our grief with one another. Today we will share our grief with God. During our time together today, we're going to cry. And we're going to laugh. But most of all, we're going to remember a man who touched more lives than any of us will ever know.
Welcome to Chapter 35 of Mysterious Goings On. I'm your host, Alex, and thank you for joining me as we squeak by on our, as promised, one podcast a month consistent schedule. As I promised at the end of 2018 that Mysterious Goings On would be back to at least a minimum of one episode a month per month in the year 2019. So welcome to 2019, and here we are on the last day of January 31st, the last day of January, and 2019. And I'd meant to be here sooner, but some things happened, and that's what's going to be the subject of today's podcast. Dear friend of mine, I've known him for 24 years, my mentor, and in many ways a second father to me, the Reverend Jeff Hamilton, a former politician for many years, but he was a minister for nearly 60 years in his life. He died at age 85 just 3 or 4 days ago as I'm recording this. As he had asked me years ago, way before he was ill, certainly older but not ill, if I would, if on his passing, say a few words at his funeral or celebration of life, and of course I did. So my family drove down there a couple of days ago. After working for a solid couple of days, I wrote him a eulogy. Well, it occurred to me that besides the fact that I'd love to share with you, my faithful listeners to this podcast and readers of my fiction and nonfiction, I'd like to share with you some of my eulogy for Jeff. I thought after this being my third or fourth eulogy in my life that I've given, might be some good tips for you on if you're ever honored with this kind of request or dragooned into it, as it were, with some people who just really don't want to do this. And I'll tell you, even if you're motivated to do so, it's not easy because there's a lot of emotions at play. One of the emotions being, I don't want to make a fool of myself, of course. The other one being, I want to be true to my friend who I've been asked to eulogize, friend or family member. You also want to be true to your audience. So there's a few tips I'd love to offer you as someone who has eulogized a few folks in my life. I've eulogized mostly older people, grandparents, and now here Jeff, who for all intents and purposes could have been my father or my grandfather. So I'll give you a few tips and some practical advice, I hope, here. And then, if you don't mind, if you would like to learn a little bit about this great man and listen to my eulogy, the audio is pretty decent, so I'll put that on the tack that on the end here and let you listen to that. But I'll just say this. First thing about giving a eulogy, some tips I would give. Feel free to say no. And I don't mean that in a jerky way, but if you don't feel you can do justice to the subject, to the person, or if you don't feel that emotionally you can get through it, you're not doing anybody any favors by getting up there and stammering and falling apart, especially yourself. Don't put yourself through that. The person who asks you, or the person's spouse, or the person's family who asks you, they've honored you by asking, but you're doing them a service by saying, I just don't think I can do it. Now, that's usually my first go-to when somebody asks me. It's like, oh, I don't know if I could ever get through it. And that was the first thing I said to Jeff years ago, was I don't know if I could get through it once you pass. And of course you can get through it. Or at least I could, and I have. I've given a eulogy for my grandfather, who was a writer, and I know I broke a little bit in there. And my grandmother, who I was very close to, I broke there, and my other grandmother, I managed to get through it. But there's moments when it's tough. So that's the first thing. Make sure you can do it. I think you can. I think it's not a failing if you cannot, but as long as you remember that you're not there to give some grand, eloquent speech, and you're not most likely burying a president or a world leader or someone that the entire world knew. You're just burying somebody that you knew and you loved, and you want to say a few nice things. So here's the thing. Decide on what kind of eulogy you're going to give. Is it a life history? Is it shared memories? A combo of those things? Decide on that. I knew that the pastor who had worked with my friend Jeff was going to talk a little bit about him. I knew that Jeff's grandson, who was close to him, was going to tell some stories. I knew that another minister, a rabbi actually, who my friend had worked with, was going to speak. I knew there would be other people speaking about Jeff, so I knew I didn't have to cover his whole life. That helped. Write the eulogy for your audience, not for yourself. This is not about you. Now, this is tough because I was given 5 or 6 minutes on this thing, which is like, oh my God, really? That's all I get? But the good news was, you don't have to tell his entire life or her entire life. I was told, tell your piece of the pie, so to speak. So what I had to do, though, was write a first draft that was about 12 minutes. And I had to get through that and get that on paper, all the things that I ever wanted to say, and then put it aside for a half a day and come back to it and go, okay, this is really more self-serving than it is about Jeff, parts of it. So I had to excise those things. These are things that are important to me and maybe a couple of people around me, but not everybody is going to care that I had this experience with Jeff or that experience. So I had to cut those things down. And I did, and I got it down to about 7-8 minutes. Which they told me 5 or 6 tops, but you know what? I don't care. I love that man, and I had a lot of things to say, and I managed to get out a lot of the really self-indulgent stuff, and it worked with my general narrative. Another tip is be funny and sad. Please, I've been both. Don't totally be sad. Don't be so morbid, unless it's somebody in particular who has lost their life at a young age in a tragic way, which I get. It's hard not to be sad. But especially if it's an older person who's had a full life, try to find the fun and the joy in their life and talk about that. But still be sad. You're going to miss this person. You wouldn't be talking up there if you weren't going to miss them and if they weren't valuable and important to you and it wasn't going to be somewhat of a loss to have them out of your life. Another thing, and this is something, I'm a professional speaker. I've spoken as a speaker for almost 30 years. And I give a lot of talks where I have a loose outline. But on a eulogy, it's a good idea to write it out verbatim, particularly if you're not a professional speaker. Don't wing it. It's too easy for things to fall between the cracks. It's too easy for you to get emotional in the moment and jumble up your thoughts, and then it doesn't make sense. Write it out and print it out in big type where if you wear glasses, if your glasses were to break, you could still read it. I don't care how many pages that would take. Write it out. Keep it brief. As I've already mentioned, there's a reason, there's a joke, you'll hear this in the recording later. Jeff's grandson, who's going to be a minister, he talked about minister's moments or minister's minutes that Jeff had talked about, where apparently every minute of your talk is about 3 minutes to the audience, which is typically how ministers feel. It's like you got to understand that people's attention spans are short and wear out quickly. So keep it brief. That goes back to where I went back and wrote the long version, and then after that was complete, I came back and whittled that down. Practice, practice, practice. And a good point of this is to get the emotion out. You'll find the spots where you can, you'll hear it in my recording, I hope, where there's some forcefulness and there's some moments, but it'll also help you get through the moments that are going to make you cry or make you sad or make your voice break. And you're probably still going to cry though, and you just got to try to keep it together. And don't think for a minute the people out there listening aren't pulling for you. They're pulling for you. If they love the person that you're giving this tribute to, they're pulling for you. They want this to work. So just try your best to keep it together. So the types of eulogies, and I'm referring to a great article on artofmanliness.com, by the way, that's kind of giving me a guide here, and I agree with this stuff here. A life history is a eulogy. There's a type of eulogy where you kind of give their whole history. Like if you're the only one speaking besides maybe a minister who doesn't really know the person. This ceremony we did for Jeff, the minister knew him. He was a minister. Everybody knew him. It was different. He was a public figure. But if it's somebody where, maybe it's a parent or an uncle or an aunt or a friend who not everybody knew, and you're the one giving the entire life history, well, there's the obituary that's been provided to the news media, the newspaper, that kind of thing. That's a simple fact-based thing you can read, especially if you didn't know the person well. I've also been brought into funerals for relatives I didn't know well, and I was asked to read something simply because I generally read pretty well. There's that. But then there's the shared memories, and with this type of eulogy, your sacrifice, your breadth for depth. So instead of, this is kind of what I did for Jeff, instead of covering their entire life, you hone in on a few specific shared memories that you and the audience have about the deceased. And that's more or less what I did. And so I found things that were about me and were important to me about Jeff, but I didn't want to say things that were so close to the bone and so personal that it would alienate the audience and they wouldn't understand it. The other thing is ask whoever's planning the funeral. I had to work with the minister on this to make sure that you understand the kind of the run of show, as we call it. Ask what they're going to speak about and let them know what you plan to speak about. I told the minister, okay, listen, I'll cover his legislative career and his political career mostly because that's what I worked with him the most on. And he was like, oh, thank goodness, because I'm knowing more from the spiritual side. And I'm like, well, look, let me cover this, you cover that. And it was really good for everybody because that worked out that way. Remember, though, this is a great point. The eulogy is for your audience, and it's not for you. Whatever you give, keep in mind you're presenting to an audience that has had their own experience and their memories with the deceased. So sharing memories of life or history that just touch on your personal interaction, as I said earlier, with him or her is a little inconsiderate. It's not about you. And they don't, mostly, I'm going to tell you, the audience doesn't care about you. They want to see the person who's deceased reflected in the stories you tell, okay? Telling stories that can kind of work with everybody, like if it's a grandparent and it's a story like all the grandkids can kind of relate to, that's even better. Those kinds of things. Don't forget to mix together the heavy with the light. Yeah, it's a funeral, but you don't want your eulogy to be too serious because that can detract from the weightiness and the poignancy of the event. To really appreciate the bitterness of a loved one's death, you need to contrast it with the sweetness of those joyful and even light and funny moments of their life. I had a friend whose father-in-law died, and this guy was a college president, and he told a story about how the man loved fart jokes and farting. I, to be honest, thought it was a little over the top and not something I would really want spoken about in my funeral, but it lightened the mood. Talking about how this very important, respected community leader loved farting. It's an extreme example. It's a true story, though. Again, I like a good fart joke. My daughter and I tease about farts, but it's not really the way I want to be remembered. But you know what? If it works, it works. Don't forget to practice. I'm a professional speaker, and I practice this thing about a half dozen times. And it just helped me to find the moments that would be the most, what I would punch up, so to speak. And by punch up, I don't mean to be artificial, but it was the points that I thought were most important. And I think if you listen to this, hopefully you can pick those things out and you'll agree. Have some a hanky or tissues ready. and just in case. I managed to get through. I felt some emotion towards the end, and as I walked away, especially when I looked at my daughter and my wife and my dad and some people who I knew very well, and of the widow who was like a mother to me. But I managed to get through it, but you may not. And when I remember when I did my eulogy for my grandmother, I burst into tears. It was hard. So be prepared. I hope these tips help you, and I hope you'll indulge me and just listen and enjoy learning just for a few minutes here about my dear friend, the Reverend Jeff Hamilton, my friend, my mentor, my second father, and somebody who, especially in Oklahoma City, was a very important, respected, and valuable member of the community. He lived a life that we can all aspire to live, and I hope you'll listen and enjoy. And I'll be back in February with another edition of Mysterious Goings On. And until then, please learn a little bit about my good friend, Jeff Hamilton. And until then, next time, keep reading.
I will also try not to abuse the minister minutes here. As a recovering politician, just pray for me, would you? It was years ago that Jeff first asked me to speak at his funeral. No, seriously, he did. Years ago. And are you teasing me? Because Jeff, as you all know, I tease people. And he apparently wasn't, because he repeated that request several times. Most recently, about a year and a half ago. And so I even started interviewing him by email. I got a few things from him on that. But let me just say that I pondered this for a while now and dreaded this day, but it cheers my heart to see you all here in celebration of this wonderful, wonderful man. I do remember asking Jeff, well, what am I supposed to say, Jeff? He did that dry Jeff Hamilton smile, and he said, just say a few words about us on the field of battle. You know how well, so here I am, Jeff. Here are my few words about you, the Right Reverend Representative, as I call it. And when I think of Jeff, it all starts with one word: undefeated. Jeff Hamilton never lost an election. I asked him about that in his time at the Capitol, and here's what he said. He said, well, my nickname at the Capitol among some good friends was Landslide, because I seldom won re-election by very many votes. He said, I won my first election over the Republican incumbent by 101 votes. Say it with me, his House district was House District 101. The elections were close, but all the same, Landslide Hamilton was undefeated. From around 1986 to 94, Jeff served 4 distinguished terms in the legislature, and his service was where his heart was, caring for all Oklahomans, for all people. As chairman of the House Committee on Health and Mental Health, he helped Oklahomans in a variety of arenas, including juvenile justice, mental health, AIDS research, and treatment programs, and education. If you have a living will here in Oklahoma, you can thank Jeff Hamilton about it. He worked hard and served without pretension or vanity. I talked to one House staffer who worked with Jeff, and he said, well, what I remember about Jeff Hamilton was how nice a man he was. He always took time with the staff. I remember that he was an early believer in criminal justice reform and restorative justice. That was probably the ministry. Jeff was at the Capitol to work. He viewed his service as a sacred trust, and he took a dim view of those who did not. He told me this: there were those who won big on the campaign trail but goofed off once elected. Exclamation point. This was an email, so. And even worse, there were those who lost who would have been productive members of the legislature. Amen, Landslide. There's not enough time in these proceedings to speak of his many successes and the myriad ways he made Oklahoma better through his legislative service. Suffice to say that he left the Capitol better than he found it, and then left the legislature on his own terms, undefeated. It was just after he decided to retire from the legislature that I, as a very naive, well-meaning, and first time candidate, we have Jeff and Wanda. And I was full of idealism and energy, ready to take back the seat Jeff had retired from, 101. Jeff and Wanda were both so kind, encouraging, and patient as a goofy kid who shared their zeal for a better Oklahoma. And I tried like heck. And Lord knows Jeff and Wanda made calls and knocked on doors and did what they could to help me win, but I just couldn't pull it out. Boy, was I down. But I just want you to know that Jeff let me wallow in my defeat for grandly expansive 3 or 4 days before he called me up and said, there's still battles to fight, more elections ahead. And made sure I understood that true defeat was to stop the fight for what is right. Now, he kept his hand in politics after he left the Capitol, winning 2 terms as Oklahoma County Democratic Party chairman. I served with him as county party secretary, and I can tell you that he took on a job at a very challenging time, and it was one of the toughest, most thankless jobs you could ever hope to have in politics. But he did it with zeal and unflagging energy. Under his leadership, he helped reorganize and reinvigorate the county party, making it a forceful advocacy field operation. And I saw him take piercing criticism from the opposition, and even a few members of our own team every once in a while. But he endured it with grace, refusing to get in the mud. Instead, he strove to build consensus with the strength of his reasoning. I believe his was a political philosophy assured of the value of education and the indispensable need for empathy. Jeff's sword was his intellect. His armor was his compassion. I am more Boswell for the many wise things my mentor told me over our 24-year friendship. But the gist about loss, whether it was a failed election campaign, a broken relationship, or even death, was that in moments of defeat, we need not be wholly defeated. That in loss, there is a lesson. You're indulging these finished moments just a little bit longer, if that's all right, real quick here. But I moved away from Oklahoma in 2003. I felt kind of defeated by things, but it just seemed like the best way for me to restart my life and career. And you know, Jeff encouraged that. He says, sometimes you got to leave the nest, son. You got to go. You got to get out there. So I did. And on that way out there, I found the love of my life on the road out there. And when I got married, Jeff was the minister who traveled to marry us. And when we were baptized at Community Christian Church in Kansas City, Jeff was there. Wanda, Mother June, you remember that day, Wanda? And we got in the car and we drove all around and looked at all the places where Jeff, a son of Kansas City, had grown up. And he seemed so tickled to show us all those things. And when our daughter came along, he and Wanda spoiled her whenever we visited down here. Amidst discussions about politics, the Sooners, and spirituality, Jeff would move the candy ball a little closer to Caroline. And so, Caroline, you say you want more candy? Jeff was there with my family, like this dozen times when my family was in trouble, and he was a strong shoulder for us. But we weren't the only ones. How many people in this wonderful church were on the receiving end of Jeff Hamilton's kindness and good works? How many? I dare say all of you. How many of us, from a variety of faiths, were brought closer together by Jeff's leadership in the Interfaith Alliance? Passing years, even though Jeff's physical body started to wither, his mind was ever sharp and his spirit still bold. His weekly emails with me with thoughtful prayers and his innumerable witty letters to the editor were high points of my week. But the best was football season. Being a good son of Kansas City, Jeff was a Chiefs fan, and I had become one not long after I moved there. He was great with smartphones, too, loved to text, and we would text each other through the games, cheering the touchdowns and cussing our terrible defense and those incompetent refs. Don't get me started. And we'd do the same to the Sooners. Well, football became yet another battle we could join together with renewed fellowship, a way to find a victory, even in defeat on the gridiron. Well, the Chiefs came very close to a Super Bowl this year, and as usual, we texted during the season. My last text from Jeff was the day of the AFC Championship not long ago, and after a heartbreaker of a loss, I just texted him a sad face emoji. Within moments, he texted back an exclamation point with flower emoji. Well, I knew what it meant. No tears. Still love our team. Friends, if we learn from loss, remain loyal to our friends, and keep compassion in our hearts, we will be like Jeff. He's not here physically, Yet I feel him. I feel his presence, especially in this sacred space where he shared so many brilliant sermons and brought me closer to God. And I will reach for this feeling the rest of my days when I feel lost or despair. I will think of my dear friend Jeff and the true meaning of the defeat.
Smile, though your heart is aching. Smile, even though it's breaking. When there are clouds in the sky, you'll get by. If you smile through your fear and sorrow, smile and maybe tomorrow you'll see the sun come shining through for you. Light up your face with gladness, hide any trace of sadness. Although a tear may be ever so near, that's the time you must keep on trying. Smile, what's the use of crying? You'll find that life is still worthwhile if you just smile. That's the time you must keep on trying. Smile, what's the use of crying? You'll find that life is still worthwhile if you just smile.
It's a great time to get a great deal on a new car when you get approved for an auto loan from PenFed. Our Powered by True car rates are as low as 1.39% APR on new vehicles. Finance for a longer term to lower your monthly bill, plus take up to 60 days to schedule your first payment. Join PenFed, and together we'll keep you moving forward. Anyone can apply. Visit penfed.org/auto or call 1-800-247-5626. To receive any advertised product, you must become a member of PenFed, insured by NCUA.
A little flexibility can go a long way. By refinancing your new or used auto loan with PenFed, you can lower your monthly payments for more flexibility in your budget. You can even schedule your first payment for up to 60 days from the date of your refinance. Calculate how much you could save at penfed.org/auto-refi or call 1-800-247-5626 to apply. Membership is open to everyone. To receive any advertised product, you must become a member of PenFed, insured by NCUA.